although it is stated in the Section 6 of Article 2 that the Church has no right to interfere with how the government runs the country, there is no such clause in the Constitution that deprives the members of the religious vocations their freedom of speech and belief. On that account, the Church opposition concerning the amendment of the new Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020 is not an act of dissuasion, but rather a call of prayer for the government to re-examine the said bill, thus does not violate the principle on the separation of the church and state.
On the separation of the church and state. Is the church opposition on the anti-terrorism law in the Philippines a case on point? The principle of the separation of the church and the state has been vaguely understood by many, seeing it as a way to silence the church in terms of engaging in any political disclosure. In the recent implementation of the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020, the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines, or CBCP, released a pastoral letter to voice out their disapproval regarding this matter. Due to this, President Rodrigo Duterte has uttered some negative commentaries regarding the criticisms of the priests and the bishops on his governance. This has led to certain confusions on the extent of the separation of the church and the state. Diversified opinions and critics arouse and the misleading interpretation of this union.
The study leads us to the statement of the problem, which tackled the question, is the church opposition on Anti-Terrorism Act justifiable contrary to the 1987 Philippine Constitution's principle on the separation of church and state? The statement of the problem will be supported by the two sub-questions that includes 1. What does the 1987 Philippine Constitution's principle on the separation of church and state imply regarding the involvement of church on political discourse? 2. Does the church opposition on anti-terrorism law conforms with the 1987 Philippine Constitution's principle on the separation of church and state?
The statement of the problem, we hypothesize that the church opposition to the Anti-Terror Act did not violate to the context of 1987 Constitution principle on the separation of church and state.
This study aims to expound the conditions in which the principle of the separation of the church and applies to and in which it is not. Did the church go overboard criticizing the fast-track passing of the anti-terror bill?
The issue regarding the separation of the church and the state has raised recently due to the commotions made from both parties concerning the new Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020. On August 10, 2020, the Chief Legal Counsel, Salvador Panuelo, called out Manila Bishop Roderick Pabilio, telling him to stay away from the politics. Panuelo later then claimed that the CBCP has used its religious authority to compel the Supreme Court to oppose against the new act, which therefore violates the Constitution. In response to the allegations made by Salvador Panuelo, Pabilio challenged Panuelo to file a lawsuit against them if there is really a violation committed. The CBCP asserted that all members of the church could freely exercise their civil rights and obligations as nationals of the country. These rights include participation to political process, opposition to the government's decisions and policies, especially if these policies and decisions might result to harmful effects to the morality and common good of the people.
To summarize the study, the recent opposition of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines on the fast-tracked approval of the Anti-Terror Act of 2020 has caused an agitation on whether it violates the 1987 Philippine Constitution's principle on the separation of the church and state. Although it is stated in the Section 6 of Article 2 that the church has no right to interfere with how the government runs the country, there is no such clause in the Constitution that deprives the members of the religious vocations their freedom of speech and belief. On that account, the church opposition concerning the amendment of the new Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020 is not an act of dissuasion, but rather a call of prayer for the government to re-examine the said bill, thus does not violate the principle on the separation of the church and state. Based on the analysis and findings of the data gathered, this study makes the following recommendations on the subject of the separation of the church and state. Based on the findings, it is recommended that church ideals and morals should not be barred from legislation. Second, lawmakers should always maintain the relationship between the church and state regardless of the separation. Lastly, lawmakers should consider at all times the principle in making and implementing laws so as not to compromise the dignity and rights of the citizen of the country. For future research, this study is recommended to the future researchers as a reference for further studies about the separation of the church and state. Since the study had only focused on the church opposition on the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020, the future research could also explore and investigate the different issues concerning the church and state. That will be all. Thank you.